Two things in life are inevitable: death and taxes. And I'm not sure which one's worse. The ancient Egyptians taxed ordinary cooking oil, and you could actually be punished if you didn't use enough of it. Sounds silly, right? Well, that's nothing compared to Russia in the 1700s, where you were taxed for having a beard. Per-person taxes have been common throughout history, but people have a habit of running and hiding. Not to be discouraged, the English invented a hearth or a chimney tax, where you were taxed not per person, but on the number of fireplaces your house had. The trouble was that tax collectors knocking on doors to count fireplaces were sometimes given a rather cold welcome. Then in the late 1600s, the English bureaucracy had a brainwave. Why not tax people's windows? After all, you can count them from outside the house. And so it was that for 150 years, Britain had a window tax, and tax collectors walked around counting windows and sending you the bill. And in order to avoid this daylight robbery, the British people began bricking up their own windows to save on tax. And already we see our first problem with tax. People don't like paying taxes and find ways to avoid it. In fact, tax evasion and tax rebellions are almost as old as taxes themselves. When kings taxed people, people hid. When they taxed fireplaces, people locked their doors. When they taxed windows, people bricked them up. And when they taxed bricks, people made bigger bricks. From unrest in ancient Rome to rebellions in England and revolutions in France, even the legend of Lady Godiva riding naked through her own town, the public reaction to taxation has varied from the sublime to the ridiculous, from meek acceptance to violent retribution. France's monarchy was overthrown in a tax revolt. If it weren't for taxes, the United States of America might still be part of the British Empire. Our own Eureka Stockade in 1854 was, you guessed it, a tax rebellion. Historically speaking, taxation has been one of the most common causes of friction between the rulers and the ruled, governments and the governed. But all that's behind us, right? I mean, we're a modern democracy, so we don't have these sorts of unjust, ridiculous taxes anymore. Our democratic system ensures that our government keeps taxes low and spends wisely. Or not. Before we go any further, it's important to ask, just how much tax do we pay anyway? Just how much? That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked. The median Australian full-time wage is $54,750, of which you pay $9,340.75 in income tax, leaving you with $45,409.25 to pay your bills. And that's it, right? Tax is paid, the rest of your paycheck is yours. Except that it's not, because you also pay about $2,530.30 in GST every year. And then there's fuel excise, and of course we have to pay our council rates, and the same goes for stamp duty, and the list goes on. Already our median wage earner has paid over $17,000 per year towards the cost of government, but we're still not finished. If you want to know what the full cost of government is, then you have to include all the indirect taxes. These are taxes you don't see because they're paid by businesses, but they increase the cost of doing business, which is another way of saying that they increase the cost of everything you buy. And then of course there's all the red tape and regulation, the compliance costs, the millions of man hours spent by businesses every year filling out paperwork to keep bureaucrats happy, all of which is paid for in the end by you, the consumer. And let's not forget that businesses pay council rates, stamp duty, fuel excise, and all of that money, all of that cost of government goes straight into the shelf price of everything you buy. And then last, but sadly not least, we get to the cost of harebrained government schemes which have jacked up the price of electricity, water, healthcare, and just about everything else. They're not taxes, and they look like increases in the cost of living, but really we're paying for the stupid ideas of politicians and bureaucrats. Have you noticed your electricity bill jumping by 30, 50, or even 70% in just the last few years? Well, you can thank your government for most of that. It's government that we're paying for. It's impossible to put a final figure on exactly how much the government costs the median wage earner, but once you factor in the direct taxes, indirect taxes, excises, fees, tariffs, duties, business compliance costs, failed green schemes, industry subsidies, and everything else, my best guess puts it at around $25,000 out of a median wage of just $54,750. The bit that's left is what you get to spend on the actual cost of living. Are you still wondering why it's so hard to make ends meet? And yet, despite all of this, it seems like no matter how much tax we pay, it's never quite enough, and achieving a balanced budget seems the political equivalent of a teenager keeping his room tidy. In other words, possible, but not without a whole lot of moaning and groaning, and the minute you take your eyes off them, they instantly make a mess of it again. No amount of tax income is ever going to be enough for a government in the long run. So I think it's fair to ask, where does all this money go? Just where does this money? Well, that's a good question, and I'm glad you asked. The money gets spent in lots of different ways, but most of the spending can be summed up in two simple words: government funded. These days we have government-funded everything. Government-funded healthcare, education, roads, government-funded drug addicts, couch potatoes. The funny thing is, the words government-funded are a lie. There's no such thing. It's taxpayer-funded. The government has never funded anything in its life. Government funding is by definition a money shuffle. It's about taking money from one group of people and giving it to another. It is quite literally robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, when government funding first started, it was in the form of a welfare system intended as a safety net, a last resort for those down on their luck. But in the decades since, things have spiralled totally out of control. These days, government funding isn't a safety net in case of hard times. It's practically a career choice. Today, you can get government funding for just about anything. You haven't got a job? The government will pay. Studying? Let the government help. Do you want to buy your first house? There's a grant for that. Or put solar panels on your roof? Perfect. It's possible to live your entire life and be on government handouts every step of the way. The government has become the iPhone of life. No matter what you want to do, there's a grant for that. Welfare programs and government funding have become so widespread that we no longer rob Peter to pay Paul. We've progressed to robbing Peter to pay Peter. These days, the people paying the taxes and the people collecting the government funding are often the same people. Middle-class welfare, it's called, better known as absolute stupidity. We now have entire bureaucracies whose whole purpose is to oversee the distribution of money back to pretty much the same people it was taken from in the first place. I remember being told that the carbon tax would cost the average household $9.90 a week, but they'd be compensated $10.10 on average. Now that's what you call a money go-round. And it's reached frightening proportions. 25% of Australian homes list government assistance as their primary income. And more than 50% of Australian households said they got a meaningful amount of government assistance. That means that more than half of Australian households depend on some degree of government funding to make ends meet month to month. But why stop at handouts to families? We now have industry assistance packages subsidising businesses damaged by the carbon tax. Not to mention years of subsidies to industries such as the car manufacturing industry, where everyone's taxes, including those who can't afford a new car, are being spent to subsidise those who can. Forget Peter and Paul. The government's robbing everyone to pay anyone. Once upon a time, businesses lived and died on their own merit. If they couldn't compete, they went out of business. Governments didn't cut them down with excessive red tape and taxes or prop them up with arbitrary subsidies. Once upon a time, families lived off a single income, bought their first house and purchased a car with savings, not credit. But we can't seem to do that anymore. The cost of living is too high. Many Australian families now feel like they need help, that they couldn't get by without that regular government paycheck. What's changed? Well, lots of things have changed, some of them beyond our control, but part of the problem is that taxes, over-regulation and red tape have pushed up the cost of doing business and the cost of living, reducing jobs, pushing up prices and making it harder for families to put food on the table. Those who are poor or have limited employment opportunities are hit the hardest, driving more people onto welfare, which leads to higher taxes and even higher cost of living. It's all a self-perpetuating downward spiral. And so here we are today. Almost every Australian government in living memory has expanded government bureaucracies and public welfare, driving up taxes and the cost of living. Even the business-friendly, economically responsible John Howard introduced the baby bonus, where the stork which dropped off a family's bundle of joy also brought a bundle of cash. Howard also introduced the first home owners grant, so that people who could afford to buy a house were subsidised by people like me who couldn't afford to buy a house. Thanks, Johnny. But John Howard's mindless money go-rounds are nothing compared to the madness that we've seen since. The Rudd and Gillard government have managed to waste money in ways which most of us would never even think of, from relatively cheap failures like the Cash for Clunkers program, through to the utterly insane National Broadband Network, and a plethora of failed or failing green schemes. That's our tax money being thrown away. And don't think that switching to the Liberal Party is going to change anything now. They're promising even more new welfare schemes like the National Maternity Leave Scheme. Oh, the Coalition will talk the talk, as they always do. They'll cut a few government jobs here and there and reduce spending in a few places and maybe even bring us back into surplus. But the net result of current coalition policy is more new taxes and more government-funded entitlements. And that means more jobs lost and higher prices. The cost of living goes up once more and more people sign up for government assistance, pushing us deeper into this cycle. All to pay for a politician's elect me promises. These expanded and oversized government welfare programs have helped to create the very conditions under which big government programs are needed. Government welfare is inherently self-perpetuating. Even worse, government handouts do not lift the poor out of poverty. The best that welfare can do is keep someone relatively comfortable in their poverty. You want to lift someone out of poverty? Get them a job. Give them real opportunities in a free economy where they can make their own way and enjoy the fruits of their own labour. Instead, we tax people who work hard and subsidise those who don't. But the worst thing of all about welfare systems, they all eventually collapse under their own unproductive weight, leaving those who depend on them with absolutely nothing. The problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Spain and Greece are a warning of what happens when you have too many money takers, not enough money makers. The greatest anti-poverty program in the world is a job. But to get more of those, you've got to get the government out of the way. Cut taxes, cut red tape, and let businesses, big and small, do what they do best. Create wealth and jobs and opportunity for everyone. But that leaves us with a serious problem. Half of all Australian households are already welfare dependent to some degree, and on top of that, 1.9 million Australians are employed by some level of government. Both sides of politics are afraid to cut entitlements for fear of losing too many voters. Breaking this cycle is going to take a radical change in what we vote for, in what we expect from government. It's going to require a lot of people to realise that if taxes were cut and the cost of government brought under control, that they could actually live without the handouts they think they need, that they could actually get themselves out of poverty thanks to the power of a real paycheck and real opportunities. We need to put our government on a radical diet. When the cost of government goes down, business confidence goes up. They start investing and creating jobs, which means we get more taxpayers. And that's good news for all of us. It's time to get active. It's time for you to change what you look for in a politician. Blind party loyalty isn't good enough anymore. Does your local politician know that you're sick and tired of the government getting bigger, of taxes getting higher, of the cost of government rising relentlessly? It's time to tell them, loud and clear. It's time to join taxpayers' advocacy groups like the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, get involved in their campaigns, and let the government know that your expectations are changing. And it's time to pass this video on to everyone you know. Your own government shouldn't be the reason you struggle to make ends meet, but it is, and it's not going to change on its own. If the history of taxes tells us anything, it's that we haven't learnt anything from history. My name's Topher, and thank you for watching The Forbidden History of Terrible Taxes.